Thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Certainly, issues of competition and choice are incredibly important to the OFT. They are almost at the heart of what the OFT does. And I just want to share with you some points on competition law as a bit of a background. But what I really want to do is not to speak for a huge amount of time. What I'd like to do is to give you some thoughts, some observations, but very much to hear your questions. I'm always conscious, I come along to quite a number of these events and I talk for far too long about things which people aren't particularly interested in. I'm more interested in trying, as far as I can, to help you to understand some of the competition implications of this sort of scheme. So let me just introduce by just putting my speech into a little bit of context. So the OFT, at its core, its mission is very much to make markets work well for consumers. And choice, competition, and particularly engaged consumers exercising choice, stimulating competition, is incredibly important to our mission ultimately working. And to do that, we have a number of different mechanisms. We have the big stick, a range of significant competition enforcement tools, but beyond that, we also have a range of perhaps softer issues to do with advocacy and education. And I think it's very much in that advocacy and education manner that I'm speaking to you today. A key aspect of our work over the last couple of years has been very much in areas where government has traditionally played a significant role. We called our public markets work, and we've spent quite a lot of time over the last 2 or 3 years thinking about areas where government plays a significant role, where public service plays a significant element, and providing guidance and assistance to help frame that debate. And I suppose one thing I'd want to just get across almost quite quickly is that competition law and competition is often hailed as a great barrier to people achieving things that they want to achieve. And what I hope to do a little bit later in my remarks is just to talk through how it isn't a barrier, how it is in many respects a facilitator. Now, there are some issues that do give rise to competition concerns, and I'll talk about them as well. But I just want to really highlight that sort of the strong message I get in a lot of these sort of discussions is that competition is a barrier. It's stopping me from doing something which, on any objective measure, is common sense, and very rarely is that the case. So we can come on to some questions on that, and I'll have a few remarks to make on that a little later. But before I get into the more competition aspect, I thought it would be useful just to share a couple of observations about self-regulation and about the importance of informed and active consumers. So first of all, on self-regulation, it's been an area that the OFT has been very strongly supportive of. The voluntary aspect of self-regulation, levering up standards using self-regulatory mechanisms, using robust and effective self-regulatory mechanisms, is to us an incredibly important part of well-functioning dynamic markets. And to that end, we've certainly encouraged self-regulation in the past until quite recently. Until there were certain changes in the competition framework, we sponsored a consumer codes approval scheme whereby a number of different agencies operating in various markets, code sponsors as we called them, did accredit themselves effectively to the OFT, and in doing so they offered to provide a better level of service than the law would require them to do. They offered to put in place effective measures to try to ensure that consumers got the best possible deal. And I think I mentioned that largely because I think it shows the attitude to competition authorities and the OFT to effective, well-functioning self-regulation and accreditation schemes, that we see them as very much as something that can help hugely consumers to make a good decision, to make the best informed decision. And that sort of takes me on to this really important aspect of consumer choice. And I can see that's very important to the sort of event that you're having here today about facilitating that element of consumer choice, enabling consumers to have the best information available in order to make the best decisions for themselves. And I think for us that's been, again, another really important aspect of what we've been thinking about, making sure consumers take active choices. Markets do not work if customers aren't able to evaluate quality, aren't able to effectively exercise choice. And for us, methods which help consumers make that choice are very much a positive. So just moving on perhaps to some of the more competition aspects, and I won't spend a huge amount of time on the law. It's incredibly voluminous, as you might expect, but I will just give a brief summary of some of the sort of considerations, then I'll try to tie them back to some issues with respect to AVR in a short while. So the main issue from my discussions with the PSA to date has been questions raised about collaboration. So I just wanted to set out very briefly the legal position with respect to collaboration between potential competitors. The key legislation is the Competition Act, which was passed in 1998, which does include a wide-ranging prohibition on certain forms of anti-competitive agreements, whether they be agreements between undertakings, and the star there is to emphasize that undertakings are incredibly widely defined. It's not just the big commercial entities. It is widely defined to be any entity engaged in what might be loosely termed economic activity being also very, very broadly defined. Decisions by associations of undertakings, effectively that's traditionally been decisions by trade associations, concerted practices, which I'll come on to in a little bit of time, but they're effectively where you don't agree something, but through a nod and a wink, you get to the same ultimate outcome. And all of these agreements, decisions, concerted practices, our concern is only where they have the object or effect of restricting, preventing, or distorting competition. Even if an agreement did prevent, restrict, or distort competition, however, it can be exempt in certain fairly narrow circumstances, particularly where it leads to an improvement in production or distribution, and that consumers get a fair share of the resulting benefit from any improvements. I've already mentioned the general prohibition, and I think this is the sort of area where competition law, everybody knows competition law is about cartels. It's about trying to prohibit the sort of smoke-filled rooms agreements which ultimately result in consumers getting a poorer deal. And in particular the traditional ones about price fixing, about fixing trading conditions, about allocating markets, all those sort of things are particularly problematic, as are some concerns, and I'll say a little bit more about this, the sharing of commercially sensitive information. If an agreement falls foul of competition rules, there are very significant potential sanctions in place. Penalties, directors, for example, can be disqualified in certain circumstances, and there's always the possibility, in the event of the more hardcore aspect of cartel activity, the possibility of imprisonment. The regime is a self-assessment one, and that often is a bit of a challenge because there isn't an ability to come to the OFT except in very limited circumstances to say, this is my competition problem, this is my challenge, this is my question, can you answer it for me? And there's a very good public policy reason for that, even though I appreciate it may be unhelpful on occasion. It is very much that when we used to do that, we used to get thousands of these requests, such that actually we weren't able to do very much else, and certainly weren't able to give the requests we received the sort of time and attention that they no doubt deserved. So on the more collaboration aspect, and I suppose this may be relevant when it comes to, for example, collaboration between AVRs who may work, for example, in the same sector or in related sectors, there are things which are absolute no-nos from a competition perspective, and I think they will be fairly standard, or they will be unexpected. That agreements to fix prices or to share markets, i.e. I'm taking anybody in the north, you're taking anybody in the south, that sort of thing, are hardcore infringements. But beyond that, competition law shouldn't be seen as a great prohibition on those who want to work together, working together effectively. Many forms of collaboration are absolutely beneficial, both from an economic and a wider social perspective, which is why I think very much that sort of perception of competition as a block is often wildly overstated, and absolutely reasonable collaboration between those operating in similar sectors is absolutely, in many cases, highly beneficial. The key question is always to ask, well, is this going to have a competition effect? Is this going to be something which disturbs the ability of operators to make independent decisions. So I think, as I've mentioned, I think the particular relevance is it's relevant to individual members. So in the event of, or individual members of any scheme, that there are things that they shouldn't be doing that raise problems with respect to agreeing prices and sharing markets, for example. And between AVRs, for example, again, there can be problems in the event that discussions of agreeing fee structures, for example, or something like that start to come up. So those are the sort of areas which I think are more problematic. But beyond that, competition law is reasonably permissive. I just wanted to talk, and I know this has been an issue of interest, on information exchanges. So I mentioned concerted practice, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a very nod and wink type scenario whereby you don't have to have an agreement. You basically get to the same outcome through exchanging information, through dropping hints, through in some cases doing a bit more than that, but effectively you substitute competition for collaboration. And we said very, very publicly, information exchanges, so they're sort of exchanges that, again, might happen perfectly reasonably between AVRs operating in the same sector, for example, individual members. Those sort of exchanges can often lead to very, very substantial benefits to consumers and to customers. There are some economic efficiency benefits, but there are also a real direct benefit to customers and consumers by reducing search costs and improving choice. And that choice aspect is incredibly important. If customers are able to benefit from information exchanges to make better informed decisions, then that is highly relevant as to whether it would give rise, or any information exchange would give rise to a competition consideration. There are sorts of information exchanges that would be more problematic, and those are precisely those sort of information exchanges where I say to a competitor, let's say for the sake of argument, another AVR, that actually I'm going to try to fix a market in a particular way, or my basic strategy in the future is to target this sort of group of practitioners or something of that, operating in a particular geographic area, for example, or this is going to be my fee structure, or this is going to be my basic commercial strategy. And commercial may not be quite the right word there, but that's my basic strategy. That's the sort of thing which gives rise to difficulties, particularly around pricing, particularly around future-looking strategic behaviour. That's something which tends to give rise to competition concerns. But outside of that context, and we have got guidance which I shared with the PSA, just on the sort of information exchanges which on no basis will ever raise a competition concern. Past information outside of a particular commercial setting, non-price information, they absolutely are allowed, and we recognise not only are they allowed, but they're hugely beneficial in a large number of instances. So that was all I wanted to say about the law more generally, and I hope I've picked up one or two points in relation to AVRs, but rather than trying to proactively address them, I'm more than happy to address some of your questions in discussion. But one point just to note before I stop speaking, at least for the moment, is that the OFT ceases to be the UK's National Competition Authority in a week and a half's time, but the Competition and Markets Authority, which will take over pretty much so at the same point, at the same point on the 1st of April, will then become the UK's lead competition and consumer authority. And that will bring together the OFT's existing functions. And there's a lot more information on the CMA's webpage. But I also should give a particular plug to the huge amounts of guidance material that is already out there. So if you do have a question of competition law, you do have a question of competition practice, you can swim in the amount of guidance that's out there. Now, I know that might not be helpful in some cases because there may be a bit too much, but there was often a strong ability to pick up a OFT document which are very much intended to be user-friendly to try to get to an answer to that particular competition question that you might have. So there is a lot of material out there, and certainly they should be helpful if you have competition questions. So I shall stop, and I should be very, very happy to answer questions, but I should always emphasize that I'm not always able to give definitive answers, and particularly on points of law. Given the self-assessment regime, Without particularly getting into the facts of particular issues, that can be difficult, but I can certainly give my impressions in relation to points you might raise.
Dan, thank you very much indeed for raising issues which I know will be of concern to colleagues here, and for your offer to answer questions. And indeed, we have the first one over here. Thank you.
Jeff Thomas, Play Therapy UK. Play therapy can be a pretty lonely profession for our practitioners spread throughout the country, so we encourage local support groups. And I imagine our support group in Much Binding in the Marsh, who might meet every 2 months, discuss firstly professional issues, but inevitably conversation will turn to the subject of work. And one practitioner may be overloaded and another may not. And therefore there is useful information there so that there's an adequate service provided to Much Binding in the Marsh children. However, we have said, following a session we had at a recent PSA session, they shouldn't really talk about prices and fees, because that, as I understand it, will be in contradiction of free competition. That's fine, but we are asked continually, as an association, as an organisation, to provide guidance on salary bands and scales, which is, of course, what happens in the National Health in any case. So are we therefore reasonably free to offer that information on what we think are fair remuneration bands for our practitioners?
And I would say the answer to that's absolutely yes. So as a matter of law generally, it's perfectly possible to give a recommendation or to give advice and to give guidance. I think where you start to get into more difficulties, and this is particularly in the more traditional setting, if you just say, this is the price, this is the charge, this is what you have to charge, that's where I think you get into significant competition type considerations, because effectively people are coordinating around a particular price. They're just using the guidance as, or the instruction as a coordination. And the fact that it comes from a professional agency or from others doesn't change the consideration. But certainly I have no concern about reasonable guidelines being provided, and those guidelines should be sufficiently flexible, but reasonable guidelines as long as it's very, very clear that these are not something that is a requirement to be followed. I would, though, just make that point about flexibility, that it would be quite sensible, in my view at least, not to sort of say the guideline is whatever, £60 or whatever, to provide an appropriate band in much the same way as you suggest the NHS would do, for example, when it's advertising for recruitment. I know that's not quite the same thing, but bands, I think, get into far fewer concerns because ultimately there's then plenty of scope for competition within those bands.
Thank you very much. And another question over here, Nick. And can I just ask for clarification on that one, Dan? That would be about giving advice to both practitioners and to potential clients, patients.
I think that, and certainly when it comes to the latter, I think that's not only a perfectly permissible thing. I think in many cases, customers having that sort of benchmark, that sort of sense as to what is a reasonable price is hugely beneficial. So I think that can stimulate competition by giving consumers better information. But absolutely also, I think on the practitioner level, I think where you are providing non-binding, discretionary, flexible guidance, I think it would be a very odd competition authority which took issue with that.
Thank you. Nick here, and then we'll come here. Yes.
So, sorry for asking so many questions. My question is about the Advertising Standards Authority and how it links with the new Competition Markets Authority. And maybe you can't answer this question, but perhaps you can take it back and let us know. But firstly, in terms of the Advertising Standards Authority, our view from the British Acupuncture Council is it unfairly restricts our ability to inform patients about what we offer. And we've had meetings with the Advertising Standards Authority about this, and we argued, I think, effectively with the Professor of Health Service Research that their approach to what can be claimed and not claimed isn't sitting with current thinking about health service research. So I'll give you an example, which they do ask for randomized controlled trials, but for a complex intervention like acupuncture, health service researchers look at a myriad of a mosaic of evidence. So they're putting us into a box where our practitioners are very frustrated that they can't actually say to the public when the public need to make an informed choice that they can't actually make that case. Now, we did then do a parliamentary question to Department of Culture, Media and Sport about challenging this. And we got quite an odd reply, actually, which I'm happy to share with you, which is that the Advertising Authority sits almost outside government, and that the accountability of the Advertising Authority as a body that gets money from advertisers and then sets rules, somehow sits in a kind of world of its own, which in modern democracies I found very odd. So there's an ongoing sort of dialogue that we will be doing on that. But I'm aware there is a link between the Advertising Authority and, I presume, the new CMA, and I'd like to hear more about that.
Yes, so I apologise that I won't be able to give you a huge amount on that because I'm not quite sure exactly where it works in the new landscape. So you're absolutely right, there historically has been a link, and the link has been that the ASA, as an independent agency, does regulate or does engage in regulation of advertising standards. But in certain instances, issues which were contested could be escalated up to the OFT. But I confess to having to check exactly where that fits the new regime. I think one of the challenges of the new competition landscape is that whereas there used to be a single national focus, it is fair to say there are around about 7 or 8 bodies now undertaking those responsibilities. And my assumption would be that the ASA backup, as we used to call it, is now with one of those new agencies. But I'd be very, very happy to provide further information on that. I think on the general point about the ASA, it is absolutely right that it is an independent, non-governmental agency with a backup regime that we've had some involvement in over the years. Ultimately, we would have a role normally in relation to any concerns about customers not being given accurate information on certain things, whether it be through advertising or not. But in practice, the ASA takes those issues. Of course.
I think the problem, it's great that you're going to explain more, and
Yes.
I'm sure we'd be interested to see the answer, but the problem is it's just a one-way stream, isn't it? I mean, what we're getting is if there's a problem, as a backup, there's an escalate to place X, which we're going to find out. But there isn't an ability for us to challenge the ASA back, except to go direct to the ASA. So there's an accountability problem for that agency.
I'll take that away. My traditional background is competition, so I'm not quite as familiar with exactly where the ASA now fits in the regime. But I'll absolutely be happy to take that back and provide a short email at the very least on that.
And we'll ensure that that information comes to everybody.
Thank you, Dan. The AVR accreditation scheme is what I would call a generic kite mark, yeah, and therefore that generic kite mark works in a public market, and therefore consumers are at risk from any products offered under that kite mark. So if I take myself to another world where there's a bottle of wine and they look indistinguishable from the outside, fantastic lazy coppered label, the same generic kite mark, but the product inside those bottles are quite different. Their provenance is quite different. One is perfectly acceptable. The other one has something in it that might be putting the consumer at risk. My question, or looking for clarification, is what's the relationship between the Misrepresentation Act and the Competition Act? How do those two unfold around that particular issue?
So I think it's fair to say, so you're absolutely, there's a very, very detailed regime around, which was included in the consumer protection regulations about misleading descriptions, misleading acts or omissions by a trader. So there is a very, very particular regime there. It's fair to say that the competition regime doesn't have a direct link up to that, in the sense that what we would normally do in a scenario where there was an information issue is that we wouldn't tend to rely on our powers under the Competition Act. But what the OFT has done over many, many years in areas where it doesn't fit neatly into consumer protection law or it doesn't fit neatly into competition law is to do a lot of market-wide work. And over the last 10 years, we've done a huge amount of market studies, market advocacy work, where the issue is inevitably one of information and whether consumers are able to access the right sort of information. And following that sort of process, we normally either provide recommendations to traders, recommendations to consumers, recommendations to government, and in some cases encourage the development of appropriate accreditation tools, encourage somebody to go down our old consumer credit approval scheme route. So it's fair to say it's not a perfect join up in the strong enforcement legal tools, but we have established this middle way to bring together those competition and consumer tools so they work effectively together.
Thank you. Is there another question that anyone? Yes, right over here. Thank you. This will probably have to be the last one before lunch.
Hi, David Kidney, UK Public Health Register. All the registers here are involved in health and social care. As somebody in the audience said in an earlier session before you came, though, this is much more than registrants who work in the NHS. They work in all areas of the public sector, all areas of the private sector, and all areas of the third sector.
Yes.
Thank you for raising awareness about CMA's role. Do we also need to have our awareness raised about Monitor?
I think that's a very, very good point. I do think that's a very good point. So certainly Monitor is the health and social care regulator and has been charged with competition responsibilities since, or for about 9 months now, and particularly the enforcement of competition law in the sector. Now, the OFT works very closely with Monitor when it's doing work in this area, but I do strongly agree with the point that absolutely everybody in the room should be aware of Monitor's role in this sort of area. Monitor's published a number of documents. I know Monitor has been considering its own engagement approach. I know Monitor officials have been speaking to other organisations. So I would say absolutely it's incredibly important. It is in many respects the primary competition regulator for the health and social care sector, and many of its publications will be of direct relevance to many of the people in the room. So I strongly endorse that, and I know that Monitor have been working to try to engage with providers and to raise their profile.
Thank you very much, Dan. Is there perhaps one quick question before lunch? Otherwise, I will, the tantalising sounds and smells from the back of the room indicate that we are nearly at lunch. But may I just thank you very much indeed, Dan, for your presentation and for answering the questions. And I think we'll be in continuing contact with you and indeed all our colleagues in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.